1941. I was born in 1936, so about 5. So I experienced it from a very different angle, down low really. And what I always remember thinking, Hitler absolutely hated him and I didn't know who he was, but he was causing all this disruption. The houses, of course, were blackout, and inside the houses were very dark, really kept them very dark. And my sister, who was older, had great fun because she would jump out at me as I was innocently going upstairs or something, and Hitler's come to get you, and things like that. My father would go out with a gun and I would go with him, and he would shoot rabbits. Had to supplement our diet, no doubt. It was really delicious. Mummy would make a rabbit stew, and then first, of course, you had to skin the rabbit, and she thought, what a good idea, I'll make gloves out of these. So the rabbit skin was hung in the line, and she waited till it dried properly in order to go to the tech where she went to classes to make these gloves. But in the meantime, a little neighbour came up, a little boy of about 6 or 7, and he saw this hanging in the line, this rabbit skin, and he went running home, shocked, and shouted to his mum, "Oh, Mr. Lawson's shot the cat and he's hung it on the line." And so that caused great laughter in our house. My father had been in the First World War and was retired and at home. He went out at night and watched out for any lights. Very important. Everybody had to have the blackout lighting. And then another thing he did was he took me around with him while he fitted gas masks. And as so many of the houses he went to were ladies, right, on their own. So he would always bring me along as a 5-year-old with him, as he called it, his insurance. And he did wonderful things. And then for the time, and he went over to, when the dreadful bombing in London, he went out with the ARP, I suppose that's what it was, and came back a long time after that, absolutely shattered and horrified at the sights. He didn't really tell us anything except that. It was pretty horrific. The Londoners had a dreadful time. And then we had our own bombs over Belfast, came over at Bangor, and this is why I've got this in the century, which cannot go off. We were in next door to another big estate where there were many trees, and therefore these were all dropped there because they probably thought it was camouflage or something like that. And the next morning, Daddy went out and picked this up and brought it home. And we used it as a lampshade here and a stand here and plugged it in. But in the latter years, I've just used it as a garden ornament. So there it is, the real McCoy.
I can remember, it must have been towards the end of the war, I must have been in a cot because I pushed it out of the bedroom and pushed it towards the landing. When Mum and Dad were coming up to bed, I had a younger brother, but he was too young, he was only 2. But I must have been frightened. That must have been and I pushed this out to the top of the staircase so that they would see me coming up, when they're coming up to bed, and I would hear their voices, probably downstairs, which was reassuring for me as a very small child. My grandfather had built this air raid shelter. He was a builder, reinforced door in front of it, and we were in bed whenever Dad heard the siren going off, and he got out of bed and opened the bedroom window and said he could hear the bombers coming across the Irish Sea. It was time to get my brother, Mum and I down into this air raid shelter. The neighbours next door came as well. There were 4 of them, and we were there for hours on end, it seemed about 4 or 5 hours, until we heard the all clear going off, and then we came out, and I can remember looking up at the sky towards Belfast area, and it was really red crimson colour because the buildings were all on fire, and I was wondering where my grandparents, both sets, lived in Belfast. Would they be alive after all the bombing? Those were my early experiences.
The night that Londonderry was blitzed, as well as Belfast, I can remember hearing the Nazi planes gone over. My father-in-law's cousin, their house was bombed in Londonderry in Messines Park just after the Belfast Blitz. My father was in the Royal Victoria Hospital and I went with my mother to see him. And I can remember the York Street was still smouldering. York Street station got bombed very badly and they lost carriages and wagons and offices. A lot of old records were lost as well. And what was saved, there was offices opened up in what was known as the Pavilion in Whitehead. Some of the US troops would have called into the house where I lived and brought some sweets, and there was an odd tin of fruit as well. They always came prepared, you know. During their time there and their leave or rest periods, they went to Portrush and Coleraine, and there was a dance halls in Portrush. There was one in Barry's.
There was a field just next door to where we lived, and suddenly all these tents were erected. And Mum was of a very nervous type position, you know, she just wasn't a relaxed person. So these young men came next door. And of course, I was very curious, so I would go over to the hedge and talk to them, because I've always loved chatting to people. Then they started giving me these things, tubes of American chewing gum, and Mum wasn't impressed at all. And she said, you know, I think she thought, oh, don't talk to those men, they're not, you know. But anyway, they lived next door in tents. I can remember that very well.
People in Belfast would have left their homes and come to Bangor, and then in our house, my mother and father, and they would have had them, the people from Belfast, for a week or two, and then my cousin and the other cousin, the two of them, and they were young at the time. They wouldn't have been very old, but they would have been enjoying dancing and things like that, you know. And so they were great. They would have been upstairs, and of course the Americans would have been going by, and they'd have been whistling out the window. And so my father got used to this, and he goes, right, okay, one of these days I'll teach them a lesson. So he came down and he said to him, right, would you like to meet these two girls? They're up the stairs. Well, you never seen two people who came down, out through the back of the house.
Did a runner.
And they done a runner. And it was just one of those things, like, you know. And I mean, even at that time, they wouldn't even have been allowed to be going to dances and stuff, you know, weren't old enough for that. But anyway, it was good crack.
Ballyholme Beach was out of bounds, and they did all the tank landing craft practices on Ballyholme Beach. The beach didn't have the groins in that, at that time. There was only a bathing raft, which they took away during the war. And the tank landing craft were then using the beach for practice landings. They hadn't the whole beach available because a ship had gone aground at Connor Point. The back end stayed at the bottom of Seacourt Lane and was broken up gradually. But the front end would still float. And they beached that opposite Morningside at Ballyholme. And I was waiting up, we moved house from Dunars to Dunraven next door, the school winger. My mother was drawing the curtains one morning. She says, Brian, something's happened during the night. And I got up and looked. The north pier had a gap of about 60 feet, and the wooden piles, or the concrete pier was there, wooden piles missing, and the little island, which was a refuelling stop for small boats. Apparently, an American boat had sailed through it during the night, cleaned it out. I was educated at Campbell College when they came back from Portrush, and the emphasis was on joining the services. My father prohibited me from having anything to do with the Territorial Army or such things. He says, no, I don't want you killed. You're more useful making the things to fight with.
On my father's side, he was just too young to go through the First World War, but I believe that he did force his age a little bit, and he was out at the First World War. At 16, he didn't see active service, but he stayed in the army right through. His battalion Fusiliers went to Egypt, and therefore he stayed on because a lot of the children in those days hadn't really been to school proper. So by staying in the army, he got literacy certificates that helped him later on in life. So he left the army and came back home, and then he got a job in Bangor, I believe in the Bangor Gas Works, when Bangor had a gas works in the middle of the town, and he worked there. Then when war broke out, they were asked for volunteers, and there was big crowds in Bangor, and sort of a rally, and he held up his documents being ex-service, and he was in the merchant navy as well. So that's the sort of man we want. And my dad went up, right, you're in. And that was it. Having said that, he forgot it was his wife and 3 kids, including me, who was only 10 months old, left at home.
Coming home from work, this other girl got talking to me on the bus, and she said that she was going to join the army. And I said to her, but you're too young, you're the same age as me. So she told me, you go and you let on that you've burnt your ration book and everything was in the Blitz because of the Belfast Blitz. And of course I did all that, and I was accepted. I went home and never said anything. And then on the Monday morning when I knew I was going away, I said to my mummy, I'm away to join the army. So I don't know what way she must have felt, but I didn't come home that night. So I was posted up to Ballymena. And from Ballymena I went as a telephonist to Dalriada and Belfast. And then when things were easing off, then I did an exam and went as a plotter in headquarters in Belfast. And then when things eased down again, that was when we all were sent to England, and that's where the experience of real war started. The one thing I do remember while in Feltham was the buzz bombs going over, and sometimes I remember being out on parade at lunchtime, and the buzz bomb went over, and that was the first one I had seen coming from Northern Ireland. And I was petrified because at 2 miles down the road it exploded and killed 14 Army and ATS who were working on one of the ordnance depots. I've remembered it several times, because because it seemed to be so low and you didn't know where it was going to come down.
They got over to France and they were headed for Belgium because that's where the Germans were coming in force. And as they were going along the road, he told me this, that the convoys were coming the other way full of troops. They were Belgian troops. And they all said, Tommy, go home. They've got tanks. You will not survive. But they had their 303 rifle, and on they went, and they did survive for a while. And they kept the tanks from overwhelming the whole of that part of Europe, which allowed the other people to get to Dunkirk and get rescued at Dunkirk. And they were then left there, run out of ammunition, and they were captured as prisoners of war. And he was there for the whole duration of the war. The first time that they were relieved from prisoner of war camp was when the Russians overran their POW camp, because all the German prisoners, all the British prisoners in the German prisoner of war camps were in Poland, so that if they did escape at any time, they had to go through all of occupied Poland, Germany, France, before getting home. No chance. But before they left, they tried to destroy all the records, and they got a bonfire going, and it was only the Russians coming on that saved it from being a complete washout, because a friend of my father's recognised this document lying among the ashes, and it was my father's record of being a prisoner of war in the whole at the time, and in the back it shows the different places he was transferred to, ending up in Stalag 21D in the far side of Poland. And a little note on here in German, I never knew what it meant, but I spoke to a German. Who else? They looked at that and said, "Your father was a very bad man." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "He refused to work for the Germans because they were getting the prisoners of war to do war work because they were short of people, and they were trying to get all the people to do war work. And he refused, so they put him on half rations. They were on starvation rations to begin with, and potato peelings and things like that. And he went on half rations, basically starving to death. So his mates and the rest of the ones who from the Bangor area were all captured at the same time. They persuaded him, "Come on, just work with us," and saved his life because he was willing to just starve to death. One of the things that happened in the camp was the Red Cross used to help him out. And you can see the winter snow, and the Red Cross give them all these heavy greatcoats, boots, clothes, everything. Took a photograph of it, and the Germans then made it into a postcard. And you were allowed to write your name and address of your home, and they just put, I don't think there was any message, just George Cree. He just put in who it was from. So it came home as a card. And we thought, oh well, at least they're being looked after. But he told us when he came back home after the war that immediately that photograph was taken, they were stripped of all the clothes and they were back in the rags that they were captured in. And that was a very sore winter for them. The first winter was very, very bad. These are the medals that Dad was issued with long after he came back, that everybody had got on VE Day, but he never even took them out of the box because he thought, no, my war's over, and it wasn't about medals, and people who got medals maybe weren't the ones that ultimately deserved them. There was other people who did very brave things, and he thought medals were just propaganda almost for the army, just to make everybody feel good.
We went up to where my grandfather lived on the Upper Newtownards Road. He had a building contractors there, and he had rows and rows of seats set up for folk, for neighbours, and we watched, I think there was a procession coming up the Upper Newtownards Road going towards Stormont direction. I can remember that quite well. Flags everywhere, Union Jacks everywhere. Yeah, great excitement. Although we were young, we knew it was something really big. It was quite an event.
London on VE Day, that was really something worthwhile seeing. There was thousands of us there, and as I say, we couldn't get a bed. People were just lying everywhere. 5 of us were kept together, and everybody was singing and dancing and that.
Probably more thoughtful, towards people. There were people who died. There were, it was sad. There were sad setups to value each day and value peace that we've had, and for our grandchildren, growing up. That, it was a very sad time. The loss of people and loss of generations.
We learned to live with each other, and that, when you're in the army, you're mixing with people of all types. So why can't it be like that and people enjoy life? In the army, it's surprising how many foreigners were in it. Girls who their parents were still in Hungary, and they just mixed in with us, and it was a great atmosphere.
People say that to me today. We were the lucky generation. I mean, we weren't out fighting. And in my case, my family couldn't go to war. But Daddy had done his bit in the First World War, so that wasn't so bad. But people who were civilians did such a lot of good work themselves. They really did. Well, here's another awful story. Whenever one of my little friends, I think it was her 6th birthday possibly, and her mother just simply couldn't get ingredients to make a cake. So Mummy had read somewhere that parsnips, that's right. So she made a cake using parsnips to try and subsidise them for the ingredients. So I went up the road all happy with this little cake for my friend, and she was absolutely thrilled to have a party with a birthday cake. And afterwards she said to me, "Oh, please thank you, Mother. That was so kind of her to make the cake. But really it was horrible." Or so it probably was. I can't remember. So that was just the war effort trying to make a cake. But I think there was a better atmosphere because while people were knitting things for troops abroad and, aunts and uncles, everybody was busy trying to do their bit.